If we have a loose understanding of how parliamentary systems work, then it's easy to compare and contrast a parliamentary system to a presidential system of government. Presidential systems are different in terms of elections, and if you remember that that's one of the fundamental differences between a presidential system and a parliamentary system, you'll be fine. If in a parliamentary system you get to just vote for the members of the legislative body and they get to select the rest of the food chain, know that you get dual elections in a presidential system, that you get to elect both members of the legislative branch and the chief executive. The systems that the nations we will look at this semester that have presidential systems will be Mexico, Nigeria, and Iran. In a presidential system, the president is both the head of state and the head of government. So they will have chief policy-making decisions as well as having some of the ceremonial duties that come along with being the head of state. Presidential systems tend to follow more of the separation of powers mold because they have that system of checks and balances, that the president can veto legislative actions, the legislature can override presidential vetoes, and so on and so on. Instead of cabinet members in a parliamentary system being chief party leaders, the president has free rein to pick whoever they would like their cabinet members to be, and they can choose from party establishment, or they can choose outside figures who they think will best fit the role. We talked about the presidential veto already, and these people have fixed terms. We know in the United States' model, the Senate is up for re-election in the Senate every 6 years. If you are in the House of Representatives, you're up every 2 years. And we'll talk about those terms when we look at Mexico, Nigeria, and Iran. There are also what are called semi-presidential systems that will blur the lines between elements of a presidential system and a parliamentary system. And this is where you have both a prime minister and a president, and the two nations that we study that use a semi-presidential system are Russia and China. The differences between these two roles in a semi-presidential system can vary from state to state, but you tend to see the delegation of domestic authority to the prime minister typically, and the president tends to be the chief architect of foreign policy. I want you to pause this video and think of an answer to this question. What are the advantages and disadvantages for each a presidential, parliamentary, and semi-presidential system? Once you think you have an advantage and a disadvantage for each, go ahead and resume the video, and we'll see if your answers match up with my answers. Now that you've taken the time to answer your question, let's look at each system in the order that I presented them to you. If we talk about parliamentary systems, the advantage clearly is efficiency in passing legislation. If the cabinet already knows what they want policy to look like, and the legislative body is there to simply look for amendments, then they can do so. And in this system, there's clear accountability to voters, because you can look at the specific members of the legislative body who crafted the policy, both as a member of the cabinet and as a functioning member of the legislative body. The disadvantages to a parliamentary system is that they can be inherently unstable, that since you see mass wave of elections either at fixed or undetermined intervals, that the composition of these legislative bodies can radically change from election to election to election. I know it's not one of the AP6, but Greece is an excellent example of how unstable a contemporary parliamentary system can be, where they went through 3 radically different compositions of what their parliament looked like ideologically within about an 8-month to 1 year period of time. Second, they can lead to hasty decision-making since the members of the legislative body are not the ones actively creating the policy, that things can be kind of ramrodded through a decision-making process. In a presidential system, the clear advantage is that there are checks on the power of the legislature since the president has the ability to veto things, where in a parliamentary system, the prime minister really lacks that kind of authority. And there tends to be more of a national mandate for both the Congress and the national executive because they're directly elected. That tends to be another one of the large criticisms of the parliamentary system, that sure, you may get to de facto vote for who the prime minister is if you're voting for the party that you think will compose the majority, but in a world where split ticket voting might happen in a presidential system, if I vote for a president and a member of the legislature who are from two different parties and they both win, they get more of a mandate from the people, more of a kind of de facto writ of legitimacy. The big disadvantage to a presidential system is that there's a huge difficulty in removing unpopular presidents until the next election. If we don't like a president that was just elected, we are stuck with that individual for 4 years, since it's impossibly difficult to try and impeach someone or remove someone from power. If you compare this to the idea of a vote of confidence or no confidence, where a prime minister can be removed or a majority party can be unseated at any time, then it allows for the popular vote or the public to kind of be more hands-on and place more demands on their legislature. The second problem is that there tends to be gridlock, that in a presidential system, it is possible to have a divided government where different political parties or factions are in control, and if they're at war or at odds with one another, then things might not be able to get done at least as quickly or efficiently as they are in a parliamentary system. In a semi-presidential system, the president is shielded from criticism because they can blame anything that's unpopular on the prime minister. They can remove unpopular prime ministers to try and increase their popularity. And the other advantage is that there are still fixed-term elections and there are more checks and balances. So semi-presidential systems could be more advantageous than either a parliamentary system or a presidential system because it allows for the best of both worlds. The big disadvantage is that there's a clear confusion about accountability, that at times it can be a question of who's really in charge. And the best example of looking at this is when the story of Vladimir Putin, where he was the president of Russia, then when he ran into a term limit, he was elected prime minister, and his prime minister, Dmitry Medvedev, was elected president, and Putin was still more powerful as prime minister than Medvedev was when he was president. Then it flip-flopped again, where you have the same two men in power, but Putin is the president again, and Medvedev is the prime minister. It's not necessarily clear all the time where the buck stops. Also, legislation can be a little bit more convoluted in a blended system, and legislation can be a bit more inefficient in some of these systems as well. So while a semi-presidential system might be able to cherry pick the best of both models, it also is saddled with the baggage of the worst of both models. If we want to talk next about legislatures, we know that the one thing that all legislatures have in common is that these are the branches that make laws. That the question becomes, how powerful is each legislature, which we discussed in the previous video. Legislatures tend to either be bicameral or unicameral. When you have a bicameral legislature, it means you have two houses, and of the 6 countries we study, 4 of them have a bicameral legislature: the UK, Russia, Mexico, Nigeria. The advantages to this is that you might see greater checks and balances, that a bicameral legislature may work a little bit better in a federal system of government, but it has the clear disadvantage of more gridlock, that if there's ideological differences, partisan differences, practical differences between the two bodies, they might not get a whole heck of a lot done. The flip side of that is a unicameral system, which is a one single house, single chamber legislature, and of the 6 we studied, China and Iran are unicameral legislatures. And this has the clear advantage of eliminating gridlock because you only have, one body to navigate policy through instead of two plus potentially a president. But the clear disadvantage is that there's not necessarily a check on power. In a bicameral system, if one chamber disagrees with what another chamber is doing, they can block legislation from happening. A de facto legislative veto exists, but you don't have something like that in a unicameral system. Judiciaries are the next set of institutions that can be common threads, and they're the set of institutions that are created to interpret the law, settle public disputes, and enforce criminal laws. If it functions ideally, then the goal of a judicial branch or a judicial institution is to maintain the rule of law. And this is one of the most important concepts that we'll talk about, especially since we tangentially discussed rule of law when talking about legitimacy. Rule of law is a governance system that allows for predictable operation under a known and transparent set of procedural laws. We want our legislative bodies to be or judicial bodies to be predictable. We want to know how they're going to interpret and enforce the law, and we hope that they do it equitably across, similar circumstances, situations, things like that. In most of the 6 countries we will talk about, the judicial branch tends to be the weakest branch in all of these countries, and it tends to be the most diverse in terms of what it looks like or how it functions. These judicial branches can vary from country to country. Courts in an authoritarian system have little or no independence, that they might just rubber stamp the decisions made by the authoritarian ruler, that they're controlled by a chief executive. The most common kind of court that exists across these nations are constitutional courts, and it's the highest judicial body that tends to rule on whether or not laws passed by governments are within the acceptable boundaries set by the regime. Some of these courts may or may not have the power of judicial review, which is the ability to review any action for constitutionality. And judicial review is an important concept because if the judicial branch is needed to check the power of the other portions of the government, they can do so. But if this branch is effectively neutered, then they don't have the authority to kind of make sure we're coloring within the lines in terms of law. We've already talked about bureaucracies in the previous set of notes, that these are the agencies that implement governmental power. In democracies, the most continuous body tends to be a bureaucracy, since the majority of individuals who work for bureaucratic agencies are nonpartisan civil servants. In authoritarian regimes, they're in charge of however the government tends to wield power, and they tend to be focused most on administering benefits through whatever patronage system exists. The common characteristics in most of these bureaucracies is that most bureaucrats tend to be non-elected, that maybe the head of a bureaucracy is appointed, but most of them work for a living doing whatever the bureaucracy does. A lot of them have formal qualifications for the jobs and tend to be hierarchically organized. And regardless of whether or not, in our discussion of democratic versus authoritarian systems, we said if one works a little bit better than the other, regardless, bureaucracies tend to be mired in red tape and highly inefficient. This is the end of the 3rd set of lecture notes. Feel free to call or email with any questions.